Good morning again, everyone. My name's Andy Walker. I'm a construction and infrastructure journalist, and welcome to day 2 and the start of our panel sessions in Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week. Many thanks to our sponsors, Cundall, Epicam and Vattenfall Heat UK, for their support of this week. Our first panel session of the day, is going to focus on networks and specifically the role of heat networks in achieving net zero. And I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting and insightful session on this particular subject. And we've got some excellent panelists to help us do just that. Mike Reeder, MP, who's a Labour Member of Parliament for Northampton South, will talk about Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, emphasising the role of community-owned power. We have Bindi Patel, who's Head of Customer Experience and Communications at Vattenfall Heat UK, who are one of our week's sponsors, who will explore how heat networks benefit the country and the role that they can play going forward, and perhaps that we should be see more of them in the UK as well. Caroline Bragg, Chief Executive of the Association for Decentralised Energy, will highlight heat networks as a cost-effective solution for driving economic growth and achieving decarbonisation. And our final panellist, Mike Pitts, who's the Deputy Challenge Director for Net Zero Heat at Innovate UK, will address some of the challenges in rolling out heat networks and also outline Innovate UK's Net Zero Heat programme. As ever, we want to hear from our audience. So if you do have any questions or wish to make any points during the course of the next 45 minutes or so, please post them in the questions box, which, depending on the appliance that you're using to access this conference, should be indicated by a kind of a speech bubble with a question mark in it. And if you click on that, you can post a question in there, and hopefully they will help to enhance the conversation and also to keep our panelists on their toes. So really looking forward to this session. It's an issue that's come up on a number of occasions during the course of our conference, and certainly was raised during our two keynote sessions this morning, where there was a very strong sort of emphasis placed on the role of particularly regional heat networks going forward. So without further ado, I would like to bring in our first speaker, who is Mike Reeder MP, Labour Member of Parliament for Northampton South. Mike, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and hello to my fellow panelists. Lovely to see you all. Andy, how long have I got? Just a couple of minutes to open up. Is that right?
Yeah, it's around about 2 minutes, and around about 2 minutes.
So, thank you, everyone who's joined us. This is going to be an interesting discussion, I think. I'm sitting here not just as a newly elected, slightly tired MP sitting in Parliament for an early start, and I have already done a charity static bike ride for the Poppy Appeal this morning, so I'm slightly sweaty as well. I should have worn some other clothes, but I did 2.6 kilometres in 5 minutes in my suits. That's not too bad, is it? I actually joined Parliament from construction, so I worked in construction or the construction sector for nearly 20 years. I started life as a civil engineer, working in the water sector. I then moved into public projects and public procurement, and then in the latter years, I worked for Mace in the consultancy business, which employs about 5,500 people, and did there as one of the directors on the senior leadership team, leading work winning and some of the mobilisation work we do around the world. So I've seen the rise of public awareness and I guess political awareness of the environmental challenges that we face in this country throughout my career. You know, when I started, I got to say, green was definitely what was not cool. It was not the thing. I was working in the water industry. Capital expenditure was the sole focus. There was no focus on decarbonising or even the operational impact of what we did. And we've definitely seen a change. And we see that change now coming through in public perception. And that was proved in July when we saw the country vote for a Labour government who stood front and centre with one of their key 5 missions to be creating the UK as a clean energy superpower. On the back of that, the launch of GB Energy and the Green Prosperity Plan that sits behind that. So for the heat network sector, and more generally for housing and for the development sector, where we're looking at how do we create more sustainable developments, the commitment from this government on decarbonising and also improving environmental resilience and biodiversity across the UK cannot be understated. And I think it's a really positive thing for industry that we have a government that's going to stick to it. I think we've all been a bit long in the tooth and have seen feed-in tariffs come and go. We've seen decisions on incentivization of the market for energy improvements and property improvements come and go. And we've seen heat networks generally weather the storm and continue to be a viable solution for certain types of development. But I hope under the Green Prosperity Plan, in particular, I'll talk later potentially about community ownership and how that plays into this. I think there's a real positive opportunity now for the market to really accelerate decarbonisation through heat networks.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Mike. Only 45 minutes or so before you can go and get your shower. But kudos for you for doing that first thing this morning, generating your own heat. It would seem on this Wednesday morning. I'm sure some of the points that you raised there we'll explore in greater detail during the Q&A session, and I'm particularly pleased that you mentioned community ownership as well, which just on a personal level is something I'm quite keen to explore further as well. Anyway, we'll return to that no doubt in the questions session. Our next speaker is Bindi Patel, who's head of customer experience and communications at Vattenfall Heat UK, who I know is going to highlight how heat networks offer a fair transition to net zero that also support local economic growth and, crucially, direct community benefit. Bindi, the floor's yours.
Great, thank you, Andy. Thank you for the invitation, and lovely to meet my fellow panelists. So good morning, everyone. As Andy says, my name's Bindi. I work at Vattenfall. Vattenfall is a Swedish, 100% Swedish-owned, state-owned energy company. We work across value chains, so we also work in terms of generation, delivery, and retail of energy. And in the UK market, we have a wind business, an electricity networks business, and I work in our heat networks business. And in terms of the heat networks business, we partner with local authorities to support them on their journey to a fair transition to net zero. And we do that by working jointly to design, develop, construct and deliver and then ongoing operation of heat networks. So in terms of like the couple of minutes that I have today in terms of some opening remarks, I really wanted to focus on the word local. So here are some kind of maybe statements that aren't controversial. So I think we can all agree that heat networks are crucial in terms of the UK hitting its ambition to be net zero by 2050. It's, for me, uncontroversial to say that they are absolutely required in cities and urban areas where they can provide the lowest cost, lowest carbon solution for heating. But as a technology, and it was touched on earlier when James gave his opening remarks and some of the keynotes, they still remain relatively unknown and in terms of literacy, relatively not well understood in the role that they can play. We've had a lot of focus on electricity, rightly so, but heat is the tricky one to really crack the nut. And we know that over 37% of greenhouse gas emissions are from heating. So if we're at 3% of heat demand today delivered by a heat network, there's an ambition to get to 20%, but if you think on a city by city scale, that could even be higher. You can see that being way above 40% of heat demand in a city being delivered by a heat network. Why aren't they well known? Well, for me, they're pretty invisible. Once they're built out, it's an underground network of pipework. You don't really see them as a member of the community walking around. It's an underground network of pipes delivering hot water to buildings connected, but the value that they provide can really be transformative at a local level. And it's this local aspect that I want to focus on in the couple of minutes that I have, because I think that's a really unique selling point for heat networks as part of wider whole system decarbonisation. So firstly, they're technology agnostic. It's a delivery system, essentially. Heat network, they can connect to lots of different heat sources. They're not reliant on one. And as an example, we work to operate the heat network in Bristol. That is served by not only some gas boilers, which we're looking to take off by 2030 as part of our commitment to the city there, but they also have one of the largest harbour water source heat pumps, as well as some biomass as well. So a heat network can take heat that's already around us, particularly in cities, so they can capture that waste heat, recycle it, and make it useful to the end user. That also has a benefit in terms of when we think about the electricity grid. We know that there are constraints on the electricity grid. Trying to deliver full decarbonisation through just direct electric heating is going to be tricky. Heat networks can play that partner with a decarbonised electricity grid by providing flexibility services, and I'm sure we can talk more about that in terms of the discussion. They're also really important as a decision maker in localities when you're thinking about how am I as a local leader going to help decarbonise the energy system in my locality. Heat networks can really provide a benefit in terms of local job opportunities and supporting a local economy. They're inherently local generation, delivered locally, and the recipients of the benefit are local too. And we need a local workforce to design, build, construct, and operate heat networks so they can help improve employment rates, but also that transition to creating supply chains to, again, support local economies. And then thirdly, there's an absolute opportunity for the community to play a really active role in how their towns and cities go on their journey to net zero. Unlike individual heating solutions, where the onus is on the individual to navigate a myriad of different information sources on what do I do to take out a gas boiler and transform it into a low carbon heating system, when we look at heat networks, that is benefit that is providing it at a community level scale. So it is an opportunity for the community to come together and help support, inform and shape how you're delivering heat decarbonisation for the community, and not just on a building by building aspect. And then it's the service that the customer gets at the end of the day. And that is a service which isn't just a commodity coming into your property and then a boiler turning that into useful heat. You're getting that useful heat delivered direct to your property with wraparound care involved in that. So repairs, servicing and maintenance are provided collectively in that monthly payment that you provide, that the customer pays. So it's a full end-to-end service. And that's also a thing, an aspect that is undersold in the market as well. We're looking to transform and upgrade how we are delivering an essential service to consumers and businesses up and down the country. And heat networks are taking that onus. And rather than it just being an individual's problem, we're now looking to develop as a community, how can we decarbonise at scale, not only delivering an end-to-end service, but also helping to provide local job opportunities and support local economic growth. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much indeed, Bindi, for those comments. And again, I know because I can see some of the questions coming through that we're going to be able to drill down on some of those questions going forward. And I think interesting that you mentioned as well that heat networks, once they're in, are invisible, and therefore maybe there's a challenge there in terms of, if you like, sort of promoting the benefits, because when people can't see stuff, it's a lot more difficult to grasp. And this is a concept that I think it came up yesterday in a different context about public awareness of sustainability and the importance of net zero. And I'm sure it's going to come up again in the conversations today and indeed tomorrow at the conference as well. And I think there is a job of work to be done, both for the industry, from those who are, suppliers to the industry, and indeed to government as well, to actually raise the profile of a lot of these issues in order that the public actually really buy into them, because obviously otherwise there is a danger of misinformation, of people not being on top of these issues in the way that they ought to be. But anyway, don't get me on my high horse about that, because I do get quite passionate about sometimes the lack of knowledge that people have on some of these important issues. But at the end of the day, knowledge has to be imparted it doesn't, you don't just suck it up automatically. Sometimes you need to tell people, and also tell them more than once as well. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'll get down off my high horse and introduce our next panelist, who is Caroline Bragg, who's the Chief Executive of the Association for Decentralised Energy. And for those that aren't aware of ADE's work, they are the leading trade association for decentralised energy, representing more than 150 members, interested parties from across the industrial, commercial and public sectors. Without further ado, Caroline, it's over to you.
Yes, hello, good morning, and welcome to everyone. It's lovely to be here. So I'm speaking on behalf of our mission for decarbonising British heat today. So what I'd like to say, I think, to add to the kind of very good comments that have been made so far by Bindi and Mike, is to give you a little bit of the kind of state of play of where we are in terms of the politics and the policy of heat networks. What we've seen over the first 100 days of government and previously is that heat networks enjoy cross-party support. The last government was strongly supportive of heat networks, and that has been reiterated by this government. Minister Fambula in particular has been clear that heat networks offer a strategic potential to decarbonise large areas quickly and at scale. Now, in terms of national policy, we are in a really, really exciting time for heat networks. Over the last year, through the Energy Act that was legislated for earlier in 2024, we have key elements of primary legislation that will support large heat network infrastructure in those areas where it is most cost effective. Principally, it will involve the introduction of customer regulation for the first time in this sector, which is going to be crucial, technical standards, and an approach to spatial planning and the conferral of exclusivity rights to develop and connect large infrastructure through heat network zoning. The next piece of work that is underway as we speak, and industry and government are heavily involved in developing, is the secondary legislation that will make that work. And we expect that to start to come to be published and delivered over the next year or so. The other thing I would say is that in preparation for that, we are starting to see really interesting projects emerge, which involve a different relationship between government, local authorities and industry than we've seen in the past. That includes, for example, the Bristol heat network that Vattenfall are building and Bindi mentioned, but also projects, for example, in Worthing and here in Westminster. Those projects involve quite a different approach to procurement that is much more akin to electricity and gas infrastructure, for example, and is much clearer and able to move at some pace. So really, really exciting. I think the final thing I would say is there are two really big things that will take this sector forward in the next few years. This is a £100 billion investment opportunity to 2050, we believe. So on the scale of, for example, offshore wind, etc. The way that we need to realise that is to think really strategically and ambitiously over the next few years about how we make sure that low carbon heat is competitive and there is an economically compelling reason for our businesses, our public sector to connect. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Caroline, for that. And again, the central importance of those regional networks as well. I'm sure we're going to explore during the course of the discussion as well. And also, interestingly, the mention of the new government, and I think we can still call it a new government that we've got in the UK. Again, something which has been an ongoing theme of our conversations during the course of this conference as well, which I'm sure we'll explore more. So thanks for the moment, and we'll return to you during the Q&A session. Our next panelist is Mike Pitts, who's the Deputy Challenge Director for Net Zero Heat at Innovate UK, and he's going to address some of the challenges in rolling out heat networks and also talk about Innovate UK's net zero heat programme. Mike, the floor's yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Mike Pitts. I work for Innovate UK, the UK government's innovation agency. Our biggest area of work really is around net zero. What we help through the projects we support, we help businesses just innovate faster and grow quicker and have that return to the economy. As part of that, we have got a very clear idea of what the future economy needs to look like. We're kind of touching that future every day. So we're helping businesses understand their place in that future and help them get there faster than they would do on their own, as well as kind of communicating the kind of wider benefits of that kind of transition for the whole of society. The heat program at Innovate UK is really designed to help us move faster away from gas and prosper in doing so. And that's using gas for heating space and water in buildings, which is about a third of primary energy. It's around a quarter of carbon emissions. And it's a big, gritty challenge. We targeted our support in doing that for businesses to help them work on taking a data-driven approach to doing so, supporting the rollout of all sorts of technology, the wider adoption of new technology, and also improving the process for delivering these projects. We think all of those areas are highly relevant for heat networks, because heat networks are critical to transforming particularly dense urban heat demand. But they've got a couple of challenges. The first is growing the deployment of them, and the second is decarbonising them as fast as possible. So, as other speakers have already said on this fantastic panel, putting kind of heat storage in, one of the things you can do with heat networks is build in heat storage, which is one of the cheapest ways to store energy. It's slightly cheaper than storing electricity. And what that means is we can really start to bring that cost down for heat below the current cost of gas, which of course will rise over time. And it already looks like we're going to be paying more in the UK for gas than the rest of the EU this winter. But we've also said, the amount of energy generated is quite a lot less than was probably needed by 2050, around 13 terawatt hours in 2020. We need to take to about 95 terawatt hours. That's about 3% of total heat demand at the moment in the UK. It needs to be around 20%. And coming back to those kind of themes for us, we think data can be used to better identify heat network potential and plan those projects, make sure they're investable. We can help adopt a faster rollout of a lot of the technology that's been developed to decarbonise those heat networks. And most importantly, applying the understanding of how we can do and industrialise this approach. So it's that kind of process innovation to deliver projects much, much faster. And they're the things that's been good to explore today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike, for those comments. Right, so we're going to move to our questions now, and I'm going to kick things off with a question for Mike Reeder, and that is, how can we streamline the planning and implementation process for heat networks to speed up their adoption across the UK? Obviously, in a way that I'm sure you would agree with, that's in line with the government's mission to make Britain a clean energy superpower by 2030.
There isn't a quick answer to that one, Andy, but it's a
nice
hell of a question to start with. Look, I think you pick up on a really important point there, which is planning and getting these projects off the ground. We've seen, and I've seen through my time in industry, projects that have just not gone ahead because of the complexities of planning and also local engagement, local adoption, views of local councillors, etc., not taking on a scheme that quite clearly is going to benefit their local residents, but the short-term pain of disruption, potentially, particularly when you're fitting heat networks back into existing developments, is often unpalatable in particularly if there's an election coming up. So I'm not saying politicians are completely obsessed with elections, but we have to recognise, and I've heard it a lot from discussions broadly about the infrastructure sector and about the housing sector, that one of the challenges we face is that we know these are the right things, but naturally, if the pressure's on at the polls in a local election, councillors who hold a lot of the decision making in terms of planning are less likely to do something that's going to be disruptive or seem to be impacting on residents. So I think we've got to try and decouple some of the strategy from political cycles. I think some of the changes that are coming forward in the NPPF, I hope, are going to help to address that as we get more focus on long-term planning through local plans and the recognition of strategic infrastructure assets and their value in the planning and development process. But I think a lot of this, and Bindi talked about it actually a bit, is consumer confidence and consumer choice. I think if people saw and recognised the benefits, it would be a lot easier to get these through into development, into delivery. And quite often, I think people hear negative stories of, and I've seen it, schemes that haven't gone as well, where they're run by a private entity. The prices keep going up. There's no consumer choice. There's no ability of the consumer to rally against the developer or the operator in what is a monopoly. Now those kind of stories are the stories that will get the headlines, and people, when they start Googling heat networks and is it right for my area, will naturally see. But as people said, Bindi said, Caroline said, Mike said, there are great schemes across the UK that prove that this works. So there's a big part, I think, for government to play in helping to educate people in actually the benefits that net zero is going to bring beyond just the carbon. No one can, perhaps outside of industry, no one can really understand what being net zero really means. What is carbon? What does being decarbonised actually mean? What people want to see is it's going to be cheaper for them. Their energy is going to be more reliable, and hopefully their friends they're going to get jobs working in it when perhaps they're unemployed, or they're going to find employment opportunities. And if we sell heat networks in that way, as Bindi said, local supply chain is so critical in the management maintenance of these things. I think we can get better public adoption and support for these, which hopefully drives them through the planning process a bit quicker. So for me, that commerciality is key. The consumer choice. How do we make sure that consumers still feel that they're getting value for money, and those positive stories are sold? Is really critical.
Thanks very much for that, Mike. I just want to turn to Bindi. One of the points that you mentioned was the fact that maybe compared to some other parts of Europe that we were lagging behind in this area. And I'm just wondering, what lessons can we learn from other European countries where heat networks are the norm? I know from my work as a construction and infrastructure journalist, I've written about quite a lot of these heat networks, especially in Scandinavia, but also in other countries in if you can call it mainland Europe. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on those lessons, and maybe what we could do to actually speed things up.
Sure, thanks, Andy. And yeah, you've kind of touched on it in that in mainland Europe, heat networks are the norm in Scandinavia and also in Eastern Europe. If we look at Sweden, about 50% of its heat demand is from heat networks. In Uppsala, specifically in the city of Uppsala, 95% of all properties get their heat from a heat network, and that's around just over 75,000 households. And that's a cooperation between it's Vattenfall, who's the heat network operator there, but also the local authority. And Mike touched on it in his comments earlier. It's going beyond political cycles and having a long-term vision and a long-term goal and sticking to it. And perhaps if I can touch on what's happened in the Netherlands and in Amsterdam, again, an example, if I get to use my privilege here, is talk about an example that Vattenfall is involved in, and that's a partnership with the local authority there. But before that, the local authority set out a vision. It wanted to transition away from gas. It made that vision really clear. It had a partnership with, we need to bring private sector investment in to deliver this. I think, again, if we could perhaps agree, we do need private sector investment to deliver our transition to net zero. It's not just going to happen on public balance sheet, but we need that partnership. They can work in partnership together. And in the 3 decades that partnership has been going along, you've now got a heat network that has been built in central Amsterdam. Before that, there wasn't one. It was gas boilers. We've had that transition, over 145,000 customers connected to the heat network, and a 75% reduction in CO2 emissions. And that's long-term partnership. It's going beyond political cycles. What was really instrumental in making sure that partnership worked? It was a 50-year concession that was granted to the bidding operator, that was Vattenfall. That gives the investor confidence, right? It is capital expenditure. We've touched on this. This is not, Caroline said, £100 billion worth of investment. This is large-scale infrastructure going into towns and cities. We need to have, as investors, certainty that we can make those investments and also that we can recoup that investment back. And that is something that I think can be taken forward and is being taken forward in the zoning policy framework that is being developed by the UK government at the moment. That confidence that if I'm going to invest in building a heat network, that I have the assurance that I can then recoup that investment, and there's demand that someone is going to want the heat that I'm delivering. The requirement to connect, needing to have buildings to connect to that heat network, but also having the requirement for the operator to make that connection, so mandation on both sides, and then also protection for the customer. It's absolutely vital. These heat networks and heat network schemes aren't going to grow unless customers have trust in the heat network and that they will be guaranteed a reliable service at fair value. I'm sure I don't want to keep going on about it, but maybe if I just stop there. But I think those are lessons that we can probably take forward as part of a zoning framework that we're looking to bring forward into the UK market.
Thanks, Bindi. I'm going to return to that going beyond political cycles a little bit later, because I think it's absolutely crucial and everybody talks about it, but how do we achieve it? I think there's actually a win-win, for politicians, and dare I say it, the current government, who are, I'm pretty sure, are looking beyond a 5-year cycle on a number of issues. So there's an opportunity there in this particular field to actually make a specific point on that. But I'll return to that later on, because I want to basically pose a couple of more questions, and I'm going to return to you on that question as well, because I know about some of the the projects that you mentioned, and I mean, it shouldn't be almost, you look at it, because we're, I think, in some ways so far behind in this country in that area. You look at some of the stuff that's happening, especially in Scandinavia, and it almost looks like sort of space age technology. And don't get me onto community waste and stuff like that. And anyway, I don't want to bore people with stuff about bins underground and all the rest of it, but we're just not at the races, in my opinion, on stuff like that. And we need to have a much longer view on these issues. And when we're talking about net zero and sustainability, it is yes, there's an urgency, but we're also talking about a long view as well. So anyway, again, I'm in danger of getting on the high horse, so I'll get off it. I just want to turn to Caroline and just pose this one to her. When we hear so much about how expensive low carbon heating is and the difficulties in transitioning and growing the heating supply chain, how can low carbon heat networks provide growth?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things here. So firstly, let's look at the track record of heat networks so far. So the Green Heat Network Fund is the major kind of support program between government and industry for heat networks at the minute. That is delivering £3 of private investment for every pound that government funds to support heat networks. And what we are seeing through that scheme is enormous, gorgeous projects being developed that I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about. The industry thinks that, I think, under the right conditions over the next 5-10 years, we can get that ratio to about 1 to 10. And then we go even further than that. So towards a kind of fully unsubsidized market. That level of economic growth is incredible and one of the kind of key investment opportunities at the moment. The second thing I would say is that when you look at the Green Heat Network Fund, 60% of the jobs that we create through these projects, through Bristol, for example, others in London and elsewhere, 60% of those jobs are local. That is a kind of ratio of local job creation that can compete with the best types of infrastructure that we see in this country. Now, when we look at low carbon heat, this is a much bigger question than just heat networks, and it is something I think that the government and all of us need to grapple with. When we look, for example, at other countries, what we see is really quite a different approach to how we remove ourselves from a dependence on volatile fossil fuels that are coming from abroad. Something that I'm sure we all know, waking up to the news today, we don't know what's happening, but it is an uncertain world. So I think the first thing to say is that other countries take a different approach to, for example, how they fund the really important schemes that we need for energy efficiency, to support those in fuel poverty, and to support the rollout of renewable electricity. The UK is an outlier in the extent to which it funds those programmes on electricity costs. Secondly, because of that, and because of the kind of historically, which is a very good thing, but the historically low gas prices that the UK has, we have one of the largest differences between fossil fuel gas that doesn't face any costs with respect to its carbon, and electricity. What we need, I think, if you look at this, is this government and all of us to think much more creatively and pragmatically about how we find a resolution to this over the next few years. This challenge has been something that we all know about. I didn't bring my Dieter Helm mug today, but I do have one. And the Energy Cost Review, if you look back at that 10 years ago, was grappling with this same question. 5 years ago, with the Kwasi Kwarteng, who was then in Bays, perhaps should have stayed there, was also grappling with this question in his white paper on the energy system. And over the last 3 to 4 years, we have consistently been told by the last government that progress was being made on a fair solution to rebalancing that would protect those on lower income, as well as finding a way to support decarbonisation to lower carbon heat. None of that materialised. So it is, I think, beholden on all of us this year to make sure that we find a more creative way forward.
Thanks very much for that, and some clear messages there, I think, as well. I just want to turn to Mike Pitts at Innovate UK. Obviously, we know more needs to be done in this area. What do you see as the biggest barriers to investment in heat network projects, and also where do you think innovation has a role in driving the growth in heat networks?
Sure, Andy. I think, well, I guess in some way I'm summarising some things that I've already said here. It's clear we probably need a national conversation about heat in general. I would suggest that a lot of businesses are doing a really bad job of selling heat solutions to customers. We're almost teaching customers to think about payback. Oh, get yourself a heat pump, it'll pay off in 20 years or whatever. And really not talking about the benefits of having a cleaner heat system connected to your home, the impact it will have on health and well-being. I mean, right now you're burning stuff in your house, creating terrible air quality conditions inside your home. It's pretty dangerous. Or having hot water piped to your house has got to be better, right? And we just don't talk about these kind of benefits in the right way. And that is why we don't have that build-up of community demand, and we have to co-design with communities. We can't go around doing this to them. I think if we have the right conversations in the right way, and there's some good examples of that, you'll have communities pulling on that themselves, but doing it in a way that works for the way they use and live in their place. Develop a kind of place-making approach to all of this. And part of the problem for that is the capacity has just been hollowed out in local authorities to do this kind of work. The expertise isn't there. We've made investments as part of our net zero living program to kind of boost that capacity and put the people in place within local authorities to start to plan these big projects. That's been a really critical investment, and of course, the continuation of that is entirely reliant on, an investment from government in forward R&D in this space, and that's how we start to make projects investable. Innovate UK has got a great track record of making businesses more investable for investors, but how you get projects to be investable and understand that from any kind of demonstration project that you're gathering the data needed for investors to have the confidence to lay in afterwards. So part of that is having the right data. We've made big investments around collecting much more granular data on the condition of buildings so we can start to understand the potential and do the heat zoning kind of plans faster with greater detail at lower cost. And I think some of that will start to go forward, but only if that capacity is there for the local authorities. And then trying to make sure we get the handoff right with the partners that we work with, so the UK Infrastructure Bank now being called the GB Wealth Fund, and making sure we can hand those over in the right kind of way. But the last thing with a lot of this, as always with investors, they want all sorts of guarantees for a very, very long time. And some of the things I've seen is that the kind of heat sources they want to be using, whether that's industrial waste heat or geothermal sources, they're saying, is there a guarantee that'll still be a viable heat source in 50 years' time? And we don't know. And that then creates risk in the project. I mean, obviously, over time, you'll be adapting, and the flexibility of heat networks is fantastic in terms of being able to add on new technologies all the time. But for a very simple calculation, investors want to say, once I build this, will it just keep churning money out for me without me having to do very much for decades? And it's kind of weird, really, that we don't have better data on some of that. And again, across UKRI, there's some big investments being done into looking at that, including whether we can actually store heat in geothermal, in shallow and deep geothermal sources. So it's pretty exciting where we could go. Just needs a bit of bravery and maybe a bit of public co-investment to kind of share that risk in the early examples to make follow-on investing much easier.
Thanks very much, Mike, for that. I want to turn to the other Mike, Mike Reader now. So Labour's Green Prosperity Plan included a clear commitment to community-owned power projects. How can we ensure that heat networks are developed in a way that maximises community involvement and benefits those communities?
Good question. How can we ensure it is a very difficult thing to commit to, I've got to say. But look, so GB Energy, I guess the instrument that we're going to use to drive a lot of the new clean energy investment in the UK, as it's gone through Parliament, one of the big challenges has been to make sure that community energy and community ownership is recognised within the delivery models that GB Energy will look at. And there's been a lot of pressure from MPs from within Labour to make sure that happens, and that is now recognised in the final version of GB Energy. So there is a local power plan which the government has published and put together, which starts to set the framework for how we achieve that. But how do we ensure that people we do get kind of community ownership? Well, I think it partly comes down to political leadership. So there has to be leadership locally to drive, at the earliest stages that we involve community, and there are still great deliverers like Vattenfall who I'm sure would be involved, but that we get the ownership by community and community ownership in the product that is delivered. I think also exciting people, making them interested in this, so they actually want to be part of that community ownership. They want to put their time and effort into being involved in the development and ultimately the kind of the governance and regulation and assurance of the schemes. That's a big part of community energy, I think, is that we make sure that we have the community involved in how the end product is run and is managed. And I see that particularly in areas where, as Bindi talked about, the job creation off the back of this is a real opportunity. So I'm excited actually by some of the new technology. In fact, Mike is probably better placed than me to talk about this, but low temperature geothermal, particularly in sort of old coal fields, where we're looking at how can we retrofit into old coal mines to pull warm water rather than necessarily hot warm water, as we see in kind of Scandinavia, out into to provide that kind of base level of heating for homes. You know, we'd still need boilers to bring up to temperature, but actually you don't need boiling water running into your homes like perhaps we would get out of the geothermal schemes that we see in places like Scandinavia and others. I think there's some really exciting developments in that. There's a trial scheme on that at the moment that I've been following, and that kind of project that says to a community, you know, this is something that is going to use an existing asset that is kind of ingrained in that community culture, that will create local jobs, which people can naturally have seen in the past from that community asset, whether it's a coal field or whether it's other historic industry, and that there's a benefit off the back, as I said before, that people will see that it'll give them lower bills, it'll give them a surety in terms of their energy costs, and ultimately that introduces their buy-in. I think is how we get people involved early and we get community ownership and community involvement in these schemes. I think the more, as I said before, the more positive messages and stories that we can sell of this working, I think the better. The final thing that I did want to touch on, though, is there are some interesting developments by SME builders and developers where they're embedding heat networks within what are very close to net zero housing developments. I'm not going to name just so I'm not, you know, all other developers are available, but there are some really interesting developers doing that sort of thing. I've seen a scheme out in Norfolk that's been done where the local heat and actually power network contributes to the overall carbon footprint reduction of the housing development. So when people buy into that housing development, they are also buying into a community kind of owned or community empowered heat and power scheme within that development. Now we see that in larger scale urban developments. I used to live in East London, and there are obviously a lot of challenges with some of the stuff that was done in kind of places like Stratford with heat power, district heating and district power. So quite negative stories, but actually for smaller scale developments with SME developers, where we're talking about, you know, semi-detached houses in rural communities, I think it's a great way to get the community involved and for people to see that local benefit, because they get better reliability, they can feel and understand the impact that network has for them, and they become advocates. And as those developers move on to build other schemes, we can see more community support for those going forward.
Thanks, Mike. I've got another question for Bindi, and then I've got one then that hopefully you can answer fairly briefly because of time. That's for everyone. But starting off with Bindi, and I think it's linked to my final question as well. But how do we ensure that consumer interests are protected and the wider benefits of heat networks are understood? Because it seems to me here there's a bit of a perception issue as well, because in my mind there's still a perception that going down this route could be quite costly. And, you know, so for example, I mean, I live in an end of terrace house in Durham, and we're obviously still using some of those fossil fuel nasties that Mike Pitt spoke about earlier on. You know, so how do we kind of, if you like, in inverted commas, retrofit areas like that in order to bring areas like my community and millions like them up and down the country into you know, a kind of a community sort of heat network? So if you can maybe try and answer that fairly briefly, Bindi. I know almost an impossible task. And then the final question I'm going to kick around the entire panel is, how do we pressurize or get the message out about a longer term view? Because it seems to me the longer term view, going beyond political cycles, is necessary going forward. And feel free to answer that as well, Bindi, as brief as you can.
Cool. As brief as I can. There was a lot there in that question. Consumer protection, absolutely vital. The market at the moment, in terms of how it's grown organically, has been unregulated. There was no sector regulator. Government is introducing that, and we full-heartedly support that. So Ofgem will be the regulator for the heat network sector, and we think that's vitally important, again, in building trust and confidence that customers will be protected like any other energy consumer in the markets. And then obviously before that, there has been Heat Trust, and Vattenfall has made a commitment while statutory instruments are laid that our heat networks where we're serving residential and micro business customers will be registered with Heat Trust. So customers need to have that full that kind of safety net of backstop protections, and then Ofgem in its role as being the sector regulator will have powers and duties to not only oversee kind of behaviours and practice, but also have oversight in terms of pricing, which we again thinking one regulator that has oversight of that. The benefits of heat networks come with scale. So it is when you're building a new build heat network, you have the opportunity to build from best practice, but obviously putting in and connecting to new build developments that have been designed to connect to a heat network. With existing buildings, there may be some works to happen in the buildings to allow it to connect to a heat network. But in order to reach our ambition of near 20% more in, if you go city by city, we need to have existing buildings connected to heat networks. That comes down into addressing some of the points that Caroline raised in her piece. We need rebalancing of levies. It's not a level playing field at the moment for heat networks compared to other technologies. There are other things that we'd be calling for, but I would say one of the main ones that we really want to address, because it has been left behind, is having rebalancing of levies.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Bindi. And just very quickly, if our panelists can just reflect on and probably answer in quite a short, pithy way, if possible, because we're almost out of time. You know, this question: how do we advocate for going beyond political cycles? What do we need to do on that to get that message across clearly? Caroline first, then Mike Pitts, and then I'm going to finish off with Mike Reeder. So Caroline first.
Sure. So I think the first thing I would say is that it is really, really crucial that we protect the kind of cross-party support and public consensus we have on net zero. I think if we were to go too far on this question and forget that, that would be to all of our detriment. So politics remains important, right? However, the thing I would say is that the National Energy System Operator was launched in October. I think whilst it is relatively nascent, I think that has a really, really important role in the provision of independent strategic advice, akin to, for example, what we've seen coming from the Climate Change Committee, which would allow a degree of predictability in decision making that I think is quite important.
Thanks very much, and thanks for your brevity. Mike Pitts.
Well, just simply go sell it on net zero, beyond net zero as well. So there's nothing better you could do for energy security, nothing better you could do for the health of the nation than kind of installing heat networks. And why not do that as part of a big? I mean, we started off by talking about how they're almost invisible. That's a selling point, right? That's not lots of new pylons. That's bringing, these things into people's homes quietly. Maybe alongside a full national rollout of fibre broadband. Who knows?
Thanks very much, Mike. And finally, Mike Reeder probably got a vested interest in going beyond the political cycle, particularly if it meant that we'd have a Labour government for the next 30 years. But anyway, what's your view? How do we get that message across?
So I think there's a few things, but very quickly. Organisations like Caroline's, in fact, Caroline are meeting in 2 weeks, Caroline, are doing great work advocating and across party, making sure that there is cross-party political consensus, and I think that's really important. But there's an action for everyone who's passionate about this to reach out to the local MP and councillors, no matter their colour, get them on site, get them into the high vis, and get them to see what you're doing. Because actually, when people see this they can live it, they can breathe it. And look, politicians love going out and having a couple of photos in high vis. So the more of those visits you can do, the better.
Thanks very much indeed, Mike, for that. and you know, a clear message there to invite politicians to some of these projects. But I think on a serious note as well, I think that whole question of communications and profile raising is absolutely vital on this issue, because I'm convinced when people see the benefits, the undoubted benefits of community heating networks, and I think it's a no-brainer. I really do, and hopefully we can get that message across to Mike and his colleagues, and his colleagues who are also in the cabinet, no less, as well, going forward. But thanks very much indeed to all of our excellent panelists in this first session this morning, to Mike Pitts, to Caroline Bragg, to Mike Reeder, and to Bindi Patel. Really enjoyed listening to you. We will reconvene at 10:30 with a session on the future of energy storage, balancing flexibility and duration for net zero. So if you're staying with us, great. Just basically stay on the same link. Get yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or a glass of water or whatever it is you want, and we'll see you in 5 minutes' time. Thanks again to all of our panelists. You've been great, and we'll see you at 10:30.